Hi, Stephen.
Hello, Bob.
How are you?
I'm okay.
Good. You should be. You're in France, living an enviable life there, I gather.
Well, unfortunately, human life, wherever you are,
Ah,
has the same
that
pitfalls
that
and
brings us directly to our subject, which is Buddhism. Let me introduce this. I'm Robert Wright. This is the Wright Show. You're Stephen Batchelor, very well known as a writer on Buddhism, a former Buddhist monk yourself, still a practicing Buddhist. Now, some people might contend that description because you are famously a proponent of secular Buddhism, and there are people who don't think that a secular Buddhism should be called Buddhism, I guess. But we'll get into all of this. Get into what we mean by secular Buddhism. One interesting thing about your worldview is that you don't view the term secular and religious as mutually exclusive. You think something can be secular, but religious. Uh, so yeah, we'll get into all this. I wanted to start out with a question that is in some ways biographical.
Mhm.
So you originally trained in the Tibetan tradition and were ordained as a Tibetan monk, as a Tibetan Buddhist monk, in Tibet. You later did a lot of study in the Zen tradition, I gather, and in the meanwhile, you had what you've described as a very influential experience at a 10-day meditation retreat in the Vipassana tradition, a tradition that has come to be associated with, well, is to some extent naturally associated, I guess, with mindfulness practice, a term that a lot of our listeners will have heard. And those really are the three main kinds of meditative tradition that I think Americans at least will encounter, either Tibetan, Zen, or kind of Vipassana slash mindfulness. So I want to get you to talk a little about the differences, but first I want you to talk about the commonality. I mean, and in a way, this is asking what is the heart of Buddhism that you want to preserve, but what would you say was common to those three experiences?
Well, I think just one little correction. I didn't actually study in Tibet. I
Oh,
studied in North India in Tibetan refugee communities in the early
okay,
70s.
okay,
Tibet was undergoing the Cultural Revolution, and they wouldn't have liked us
okay.
as hippies showing up. What Buddhism is, again, one of these, it's like Christianity. What is the heart of Christianity?
Mm-hmm.
And it's a very difficult question to answer. But personally, what I think has been a constant thread throughout my involvement in these three different forms of Buddhism is one, a commitment to a certain kind of attention, a certain kind of awareness, a certain sensibility that has to do with how we pay attention, how we experience ourselves as a mortal creature in a fluid, changing, tragic, and in some levels impersonal world in which we find ourselves thrown, as some philosophers say, and with the only certain prospect that we will be thrown out at death. And each of these traditions has different ways, basically, of coming to terms with birth and death. So I could argue that the heart of Buddhism is coming to terms with birth and death. But then that would also be the heart of Christianity or Islam too, I guess, in some ways.
Right.
But
And
so
can I just interject here? Well, let me interject two things. First of all, let me interject that I forgot to mention some of your books. You're very well known for a book that's almost 20 years old now called Buddhism Without Beliefs. Your most recent book is called After Buddhism: Rethinking the Dharma for a Secular Age, published by Yale University Press. Both of these address the issues we're going to talk about. Now, the other thing I want to interject is just that the fact that eventually our lives will end does point to a big thing that separates your secular Buddhism from what some people would call traditional Buddhism, which is there rebirth?
yeah.
You may leave open the possibility of rebirth, but you're certainly not counting on it, and you want to separate your secular Buddhism does not give people that kind of reassurance about death, right?
No, no, it doesn't at all.
Okay.
But you have to remember also that in Buddhism, traditional Buddhism, rebirth is not seen as consolatory. It's actually seen as the problem. I mean,
Mm-hmm,
the
mm-hmm.
whole aim of traditional Buddhism is to free yourself from the cycle of birth and death and not get reborn again. Westerners are drawn to rebirth because it gives them the the possibility of not really dying.
Although if you live a sufficiently virtuous life in Buddhism, you can have a pretty nice subsequent life, right?
Oh, there is this whole payoff thing,
right? And there are also realms of hell, which a lot of Westerners don't understand about traditional Buddhism. But you can go to hell. You won't spend eternity there because there will be another afterlife, but it'll be bad.
No, that's right. I mean, the karma rebirth thing does provide a cosmic frame for seeing and understanding our lives in a much bigger context than that of just our 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years here on Earth. And I think one of the things rebirth has provided in Asian societies is basically to locate the individual person and community in a much grander sense of their life, their brief life, and often in pre-modern societies, these could be short, brutish lives. That there's some kind of hope, there's some kind of prospect that, we are living in this world not just for our immediate gratification, but for something greater, something that transcends us. And Buddhism, of course, like Hinduism and Jainism, believes that after physical death, there's some part of ourselves, again, what that is a big debate, but something, let's say consciousness, will carry on into another birth, and that will carry with it the residue, the legacy of your past acts, and if they're good, then that'll have a nice rebirth and so on. But the point is, I just think that whole way of looking at the world is really outdated. It is a reflex, really, of classical Indian cosmology. It's a pre-modern worldview that, in the light of the way we understand human evolution, the way we understand how consciousness emerges out of the organism and the brain, it's very difficult to really understand what this is all about. And to me, the primary question has to be the question the Buddha himself posed in his own quest, and that is, how do I come to terms with having been born and having to die? And I would argue that there is a strong case to be made. The Buddhist teaching is primarily a teaching on how we can learn to flourish fully as human persons in this world, in our societies, in the human community, in the community of all living beings, as it were. And if there is a future life, then that would be the best way to prepare for it. And if there is not a future life, we will have done the very best we can in this world. Now, there are early Buddhist texts that actually say that. The Kalama Sutta is the best case, where the Buddha says exactly that point. And so I'm not rejecting traditional Buddhism. In fact, I'm recovering texts that have often been marginalized in traditional Buddhism because they don't fit the standard view of death and rebirth and karma and so on, which is very much, to me, is far more to do with Indian religious tradition than it does with what is specific and, I think, particularly illuminating about what the Buddha himself taught.
So you're saying the Buddha inherited from his milieu the idea of rebirth, and he didn't fight it. It was taken for granted, but that's not what you think is important about his work. And in fact, you think you can find early texts where that you might call the practical equivalent of secular. Maybe you would even call them secular in the sense that they are addressing these questions. How do you flourish in this life? Notwithstanding the fact that you know that you're going to die, how do you cope with death and so on? How do you do all this without the reassurance, without thinking about rebirth or a next life? How do you do it in naturalistic terms, you might say?
That's correct. And the concept of rebirth was simply the way Indians, for the most part, there were exceptions, but for the most part, saw how the world worked. And this wasn't even an exclusively Indian idea. You'll find Pythagoras and Plato, they both believed in rebirth. And rebirth was an idea that continued right up until, the Christian era. So I think it's an idea that actually sprung from an agrarian understanding of the cycles of life. And people began to, see, just as you plant a seed and it grows into a plant and then it dies, and then miraculously in the spring it comes up again. It's very much a cyclical understanding of the world that would be characteristic of agrarian societies in different parts of the world. So I don't think it's remotely to do with anything essentially Buddhist. But the fact is that Buddhists over the centuries have taken this as a primary kind of doctrinal belief, and it's become embedded and integrated into Buddhist teaching in ways that are it's actually quite difficult to disentangle it from the rest of the philosophy and the practice. But I think it's, we're in a stage now where we really have to go back to these early sources and try to rethink what the Dharma, which is what Buddhists call Buddhism, is actually offering us, and what it's telling us, and how it can provide us with methodologies to actually enhance the quality of our lives.
And what's the closest you can come to putting that in a nutshell? What is the 60-second, 30-second version of the Dharma, of the Buddha's teachings, for your purposes, or the secular version?
Okay, it's very easy. It's called ELSA, E-L-S-A. It means embrace, let go, stop, and act. And that is a rereading of the Four Noble Truths. In other words, to embrace suffering, in other words, to embrace life in all of its dimensions, to let go of the instinctive and to conditioned reactive patterns of fear and greed and so forth and so on that come up almost spontaneously in many situations, to stop that behavior and come to rest in a clear, non-reactive space of mind, and from that clear, non-reactive space of mind to embark on an ethical life, which is called the Eightfold Path. So ELSA, embrace, let go, stop, act. It's even less than 30 seconds.
That was very good. So part of the idea, a kind of big part, I think, is that the problem with things that you don't like and things you find unpleasant is that you don't like them and that you find them unpleasant. And rather than wishing for them to go away, you need to find a different relationship with them.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
And I gather the meditative techniques, if I ask you, okay, so back to this biographical question, you've done Tibetan, Zen, Vipassana, mindfulness. What do they have in common? I assume that the meditative techniques in all of those cases helped with that challenge.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, although I'm not a traditional Buddhist, and for many people I'm not even a Buddhist, I nonetheless, everything I do draws upon what I've learned from these different traditions. From the Tibetan tradition, I was in a very scholarly tradition, the Gelugpa, and my training as a monk involved logic, epistemology, philosophy, psychology, immensely helpful, and it gave me a grounding in the fundamental Buddhist terminology and logic of how Buddhist thinking works. Basically, I was trained as a theologian, that's what we call it in the West. The Zen tradition emphasizes the primacy of questioning, inquiry, mystery, immediacy, spontaneity, creativity, all of which I think are profoundly informing what I do. And the Theravada or the Vipassana or the mindfulness tradition goes back very much to what the historical Buddha taught, and brings and emphasizes within that this concept of mindfulness, which I've always felt to be right at the very heart of Buddhism. It's not some sort of, optional thing. It's there in the Eightfold Path. And what is most remarkable in all the 40 years I've spent studying Buddhism is how mindfulness has taken off into the mainstream of contemporary life. If someone had told me in the 1970s that in 40 years' time you'll be able to practice mindfulness on the National Health Service in Britain, I would have written them off as crazy, but it's happened. Mm-hmm. And it's quite extraordinary the extent to which this ancient Buddhist practice has found its way into the world we live in today. And I find that extraordinary and a real validation of a great deal of the work that I've been doing, obviously not just by myself, but with my colleagues and friends over the years.
And what do you think is the key to its appeal? And I guess I'm also asking you to quickly define it in the course of answering that.
Okay. Well, it's very simple. I mean, this is the weird thing. It's incredibly simple. It's basically learning how to stop and look instead of just reacting. So if you're using mindfulness, let's say, to overcome anxiety attacks or something, instead of as soon as the first anxious thought pops into your mind, which then sort of hooks you and then drags you along and proliferates into all of these horrible anxious ideas you have, you just notice it at the outset. It's a thought. It's just words coming up in my brain for whatever reasons. And I can see it as such. I can step back and just observe that process at work. And if I do so, I'm not saying this is easy, but if I do so, after a while, the thought will kind of just fizzle out of its own accord. It's only by my fueling it with all my other worries and fantasies that it proliferates and develops and builds up a head of steam, and I have a serious anxiety attack. And the principle behind mindfulness in that therapeutic context is exactly the same as the principle behind what a monk in a forest in Thailand will be doing to become enlightened. Exactly the same. It's about learning to stop, come to rest in a non-reactive space, and from there, learning to respond to life with greater consciousness, with greater sense of awareness of what else is going on around you, what other people's needs are, and so on, rather than just habitually and compulsively letting the old patterns kick in and just drive you into saying and doing things you might subsequently regret. So it's very simple, difficult but simple.
Okay, so there's an interesting feature of your perspective, and I think it might be a tension within it. I don't know, you tell me, but on the one hand, you put a lot of emphasis, I think, on the adaptation of spiritual traditions to the time in which they're being practiced, right?
Yes.
And in fact, I think there are people who would point out that the way you've just described mindfulness, although it's not inconsistent with ancient texts, if you went and looked at the kind of the Bible of mindfulness, the Satipatthana Sutra or whatever, what you just said wouldn't like leap out at you, right? I mean, it's a long thing about, okay, think about this, think about that, think about, it never says stop and live in the moment.
Well, it doesn't say stop and live in the moment. That is true. That is a sort of Western
right.
idiomatic way of phrasing that. But it does say, and I'm quoting pretty much, it says the monk will go into the forest and sit at the root of a tree, and when he's breathing out long, he knows he's breathing out long, and when he's breathing out short, he knows he's breathing out short. And that's kind of it. In other words,
although it gets into a lot of other stuff, and think about your corpse when you're dead, and think about it says a lot of stuff we don't hear at modern meditation centers very often. But anyway, I take your point that yes, anybody who did what it says to do would find themselves doing what you're describing. I'm not really contesting that, but I am. The other half of the question was on the one hand, you do emphasize, I know, an adaptation, and we have to have a spiritual worldview that makes sense for our current time. On the other hand, and this is, I think, very much what you're after in your latest book, After Buddhism, at least it comes up, you're interested in kind of grounding your view of Buddhism in what you think the Buddha himself actually emphasized, which, of course, involves this difficult task of figuring out what of the things attributed to him he might have actually said. But in any event, I'm kind of asking, why does it matter to you what the Buddha actually said? Now, so people you might call religious Buddhists, it matters because they have a kind of religious reverence for the person, right? Oh, yeah. And so, it's like saying why does it matter to a Christian what Jesus said? Well, obviously, they believe he's the Son of God, so that carries a certain authority with it. And although Buddhists don't describe the Buddha that way, religious Buddhists have that kind of reverence toward him. Sure. And they still pray to him, And so my question is, why should a secular Buddhist care what the Buddha actually said?
Well, a secular Buddhist is a person who is very concerned with the seculum, in other words, with this time and with this age. And there's no room here for gods or for mystical Buddhas floating in and out from different realms. It's about coming very much into a profound acceptance of our humanity. And if we are to practice the Dharma, which the historical Buddha Gautama taught, I find that it's very valuable to isolate, or let's say to tease out those elements of his teaching which are not contingent upon the worldview of ancient India. They're not contingent upon the devotion of his followers at that time, but they're entirely contingent upon what he has to say to human beings at his time, in his seculum, teachings that can be applied I would say, just as effectively today as they could have been then. So in other words, emphasizing the human Buddha, the humanity of the Buddha, is one of several hermeneutic approaches whereby we have a way to sort of separate out the stuff that has to belong to ancient India, ancient Indian culture and belief and so on, and the things that the Buddha said that we cannot derive from that context, that seem to be the result of his own experience, his own insight, his own vision. And the reason I find those elements most engaging is because they tend to be the most radical elements. There's very little religiosity in them. It's very difficult when you imagine the Buddha living in his time in India at that period to see anything going on there that would correspond to what we call religious today. It's a bit like Jesus and his disciples around the Lake of Galilee. You wouldn't, if you could see them from a Mars or something, it wouldn't look like a religion. It would be much closer, in fact, to what we might find in Greek philosophy. I think the Buddha is very close in spirit and in style and in many other things to people like Pyrrho, Epicurus, the Stoics, again, which we don't think of as religious. They're practical philosophies that are not reducible to simple techniques. And here I think mindfulness we do have to treat with some caution because we single it out as though it's the be-all and the end-all of the Dharma. It's not. It's operative within the ELSA framework, embracing the world, letting go of reactivity, stopping, acting. It's embedded within ethics. It's embedded within a philosophy, which is far more than just paying attention and being here and now in the moment. But nonetheless, that complex of ideas and values and practices, I feel, is completely independent of any need to hold beliefs that have to do with reincarnation or laws of karma or different realms of existence, which was the case in most Buddhist societies there. So to me, going back to the early teachings, recovering the historical figure of Gautama humanizes the Dharma, makes it very applicable, makes it something that we don't have to have complicated interpretations to understand it. It's straightforward, it's practical, and basically try it and see. Does it work? Is it effective? It's pragmatic, it's therapeutic. All of which are, which are of course values that we honor in our culture today. And there we find them, I think, in a different form, obviously. But that is what speaks to me from the early tradition that does not find such a clear voice when we get into some of the later Buddhist schools.
Okay. So I gather the idea is that it's not that Jesus and the Buddha weren't religious in the terms of their day. And indeed, if we could eavesdrop on Jesus and the disciples, they would make references to God. But it's that the reason they're remembered is not just because they accepted what they inherited. It's because they said something new, and you're interested in what the Buddha said that was new. So what are the main things he said that you think were new, or that you think he said that were new?
Okay, well, first of all, the principle of conditionality, or they sometimes call it dependent origination, a view of the world that had no room whatsoever or no need whatsoever for any kind of transcendent God or Brahman to sort of get the world going or to somehow render it meaningful, to provide a base for ethics. The Buddha had a very clear sense that the totality of life is effectively made up of impersonal, empirical processes of cause and effect.
Right.
That hadn't been said before. Secondly, his emphasis on meditation as mindfulness, which again completely goes against what meditation meant at that time. Meditation for the Brahmins and the Jains and others was about deep introspective practices that give you access to a transcendent dimension within yourself, which may be called Atman or Brahman or something. The Buddha turns that on his head and he says, no, meditation is paying attention to your breath, your body, your feelings, your perceptions, your mind states, what other people are saying, what's going on around you. It's a meditation that is directed towards the complexity of the phenomenal world alone. It's not a contemplation of some noumenal reality which is out of sight. Thirdly, it has to do with a practice that is concerned with the performance of a set of interrelated tasks, which I've called ELSA, embrace, let go, stop, act, rather than adopting a set of beliefs about things that we cannot actually have direct access to, like God or karma or whatever. And fourthly, it has to do with an approach that is primarily self-empowering. The Buddha wants us to be our own authority. He wants the Dharma alone to be our guide, not some physical teacher. And he seeks to inspire his followers to become autonomous, to become independent in their practice, is what he calls it. All of those four things are quite at odds with the bulk of what we'll find in Brahmanism, Hinduism, Jainism, and the other Indian schools. Okay. And I think it's also, it's much closer to Hellenistic philosophy, basically.
Okay. So a couple times in there you mentioned the word self, and once you mentioned the Sanskrit term for that, Atman. What you didn't mention is the idea that the self doesn't exist, which I think a lot of people would say was his most important contribution to the philosophy of the day.
That's bullshit. There's nowhere in the early canon where the Buddha says the self doesn't exist. This is a very odd thing to hear. I realize that many of your listeners are probably saying, wait a minute, I thought the Buddhas were saying there is no self. No, he doesn't actually say that. This is what's bizarre. The doctrine of no self is a later Buddhist development.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's interesting if you read the so-called Discourse of the Not Self, which is said to be a very early text. I mean, I want to be clear what you're saying. If you read it, there's nowhere where he actually says this self doesn't exist. It's an inference you could draw. But I want to be clear, you're not saying that's not an early text. You're just pointing out that he does not explicitly say there that the self doesn't exist.
That's right, absolutely right. He never says that. The second discourse, the one you're referring to, the Anatta Lakkhana Sutta, the discourse on the characteristics of not self, not self. He's basically saying, look, you are not your body, you are not your feelings, you are not your perceptions, your consciousness. And do not think of these things as you. But he doesn't then draw the conclusion that a lot of Buddhist philosophers subsequently drew, therefore there is no self. Right. That doesn't follow at all, completely unnecessary. When he is in fact asked in a very famous dialogue with a man called Vacchagocha, who's not a Buddhist, he just comes up and asks questions. He says, is there a self? Buddha remains silent. And then Vacchagocha says, okay, then is there not a self? Buddha remains silent. And then Ananda, the Buddha's attendant, says, well, why didn't you answer that guy's question? And he said, if I'd said there is a self, that would have led him into the view of eternalism, permanence. If I'd said there's no self, that would have led him into the view of nihilism. Mm-hmm. He doesn't make pronouncements about the existence or the non-existence of the self. It's quite clear. Mm-hmm. But Buddhist philosophy, which subsequently emerged, makes a big deal out of all of this, and I think it gets it wrong, frankly. Yeah. And this is kind of odd to say, but I'm not alone in saying this. I think any scholar will agree that there is nowhere in the Pali Canon where the Buddha says there is no self. And he uses the word self, atta, atman, in a totally non-problematic way.
Yeah, it's true. There are people who have made this argument. It's also true they tend to get shouted down by... And of course, I mean, it's funny, religious traditions tend to emphasize distinctions between themselves and what you might call competing traditions. And of course, one thing Buddhism can say, you can argue that a certain amount of what we think of as Buddhism can actually be found in the kind of so-called Hindu milieu in which it arose. But one thing you could say, if you believe that Buddhism holds there is not self, that, well, this is at least different. But you can say this would distinguish it from Hinduism, but there is the argument that if you try to make sense of that crucial discourse, the easiest way to make sense of it is as a strategy. He's recommending a strategy that you shouldn't think of these various things within you that trouble you as being yourself, as being, they are not an inherent, you don't have to identify with them. That's one way of looking at the take-home.
Exactly. And the self, you see, I think the Buddha used the word self as basically a way of designating a specific organism which has a particular identity, in the same way that we would differentiate between a bottle and a chair and a table and whatever. It's a non-problematic term. Certainly, Buddhism doesn't then propose that there exists a permanent, eternal self, or the end after death will unite with Brahman. Of course, it doesn't get into any of that. But frankly, I think the deeper problem is that Buddhism at some point shifted from being a task-based ethics into a truth-based metaphysics. And this is the main point I make in my book, After Buddhism. Admittedly, it's somewhat of a theological argument, but I think it's very important because I feel that the core of the Dharma is ethical. It's not ontological. If anything, the Buddha would have been what we would call something like a Pyrrhonian skeptic. He simply wasn't interested in making these kind of truth claims as a means to sort of bolster and justify his teaching. It wasn't his interest. He was interested in coming to terms with what it means to be born and to die, living a good and ethical life, becoming more sensitized to the suffering of oneself and the suffering of others and responding appropriately. Mm-hmm. It's an ethical system.
Right.
It's not based on the need to have some ontological underpinning, the nature of the self or the nature of whatever.
Right.
It's unnecessary.
Right. But there is an interesting issue there, which is that a lot of Buddhists connect the metaphysical doctrine of not self with a selfless ethic, right? So they say that the meditative apprehension of not self is a way to most fully realize and appreciate and act on the idea that all other beings are at least as important as you. Mm-hmm. So selflessness in one sense is said to lead to selflessness in another sense, right?
Yeah. No, I agree with that. It's certainly true that if we begin to disidentify with our body and our minds and our thoughts and think of ourselves really as more of a kind of a narrative process that is highly contingent upon numerous physical, mental, emotional, cultural, and other factors, then of course that diminishes quite radically our commitment to a sort of, some kind of real quasi-permanent identity, me, that is the most important thing in the world. So certainly Buddhist meditation, mindfulness, and so on is very much about eroding that conviction. But I would argue that that conviction is probably neurobiological in origin. It's never going to entirely fade away. But it does get in the way of enabling us to engage with the world in a more selfless way. So by paying attention to the mark of not self, in other words, when you sit in meditation and you have feelings in your body or thoughts in your mind, you consciously recognize that that's not me or mine. It's just an impersonal process that is coming about because of past conditions. And the more that you do that, the more selfless you become. I agree. I think that's crucial. I do feel that there's a very important ethical link here, that once we erode and diminish that intuition of me as somehow the center of the world, we open ourselves up to embrace more readily the fact that we're all in the same boat, whether other people or animals or insects or whatever it might be, that we are sharing in this same creation. We are distinguished by our humanity, our capacity to think and speak and learn, but basically we're made of the same DNA, the same genetic stuff as carrots and cauliflowers and blades of grass. And that's a wonderful way in, I think, to this ability to transcend one's self-interest and to really find oneself engaging with the life that infinitely transcends you, and yet which is effectively the same stuff.
And would you say that the three major kind of meditative traditions we alluded to, well, first of all, that they all, to some extent, assist you on that path. But even if the answer is yes, would you say that any of them is a more direct or an easier way to get yourself on that path? Is mindfulness seems like the most straightforward approach to that. You're examining parts of you that you may not necessarily need to identify with. And of course, to get back to the Four Noble Truths, the most fundamental of those is this generic thirst, desire, greed, whatever you want, the longing for things. Which of course helps make sense of the idea that this is going to lead you to be more selfless. If you, in an ethical sense, if you let go of that, obviously you'd be a very different person. Is mindfulness a more direct path to this ethical dimension?
Well, that's what the Buddha said. I mean, in the beginning of the Satipatthana Sutta, he says mindfulness is the only way to nirvana. It's usually politely translated as the direct way. But that's what he says. Now, I do feel that all the other Buddhist traditions, because they're Buddhist, do include a dimension of mindfulness. They may not call it that. In Tibetan Buddhism, they might talk of Mahamudra or Dzogchen. In Zen, they'll talk of, no mind or whatever. But to practice any of those traditions requires the same degree of cultivating a quality of attention that is present, that is non-reactive, that is open, that is empathetic. And I think it all very much depends on the individual person. I think some people will find a Zen approach or Tibetan approach or maybe some other approach just works better for them. It might have to do with they find the communities more supportive, or that they might find the teacher speaks more directly to their condition, or they might find some of the philosophy or the literature or the poetry is more evocative for them. Some people might find the Theravada Vipassana tradition a bit cold and clinical. People do, and so they
Theravada being the one associated with Vipassana and mindfulness.
Yeah, exactly. Vipassana is a sort of somewhat secularized form of Theravada Buddhism, which was founded in Sri Lanka in the 5th century.
And Vipassana means insight, and there's a whole story there, but it's closely associated with mindfulness.
Mindfulness and Vipassana are effectively coming out of the same source.
Okay, so you mentioned the emphasis on causality and the kind of the pervasiveness of causal influence, and I think some people don't appreciate this, but Buddhism is in that sense a very scientific worldview, and that's the idea that everything is always interacting with everything causally shapes some of the key philosophical doctrines, and you use the phrase dependent origination, I guess. But that phrase also is used sometimes to refer to a kind of causal, a formally articulated, 12-part or something, causal chain that explains rebirth. Now, I don't think you're embracing that version of it because you don't want to emphasize rebirth or necessarily believe in it yourself. So there's dependent origination as kind of generic causality, and then there's it as the framework of rebirth. And you're not talking about the latter. And the question I want to ask you is, so how do you think about your connection to the future in a Buddhist context? You don't have to think about it at all, of course. But
the future meaning
after you die.
Future
in a Buddhist context, if you don't believe in rebirth.
Well, I don't believe. I'm agnostic about rebirth. Maybe it exists. I don't know. I find it very difficult to understand what it could possibly mean. But the point is, I think it's irrelevant, frankly. Whether it exists or not, I think it's totally irrelevant because it doesn't really make much difference to how I deal with what I'm saying to you now, for example, for how I live my life from moment to moment. My own approach to death would be to approach my end with as much attention and awareness and mindfulness as I possibly can, to seek to go into death as an encounter with the greatest mystery that life affords us. Death to me is profoundly mysterious, and death to me is inseparable from what we understand by life. So I offer a lot of meditations on death, because the more we think about our own end and the fact that our own end could occur at any moment, that is an extraordinarily effective way of highlighting what it is to be alive, to see, to hear, to smell, to taste, to touch. And so death, I think, should always be something that is in one's awareness. Very, very important. I think, though, not as something to sort of scare you into being good so that you'll have a good bunch of karma for your next life, but in order that you can live this life more totally, more fully, more honestly, more deeply, I would say. And so when death actually comes, which it will one day, all I can hope is that I will be able to go into it without fear. I'll be able to treat it as the profound mystery it is without any preconceived ideas as to what it may or may not lead to, and to hopefully be able to consider how I've lived my life to the full in such a way that the consequences of my actions, karma, will continue after I'm gone. My books will still be around. This podcast will probably be around now forever. And so I won't cease to exist after I'm dead in some ways. In fact, my work will continue. And that is how I would treat the idea. To me, rebirth is we can put aside, but not the principle of ethical actions or the principles of what they call karma. That will continue after we're dead, whether there's rebirth or not.
Right. And whether you write books or not, right? I mean, I assume you're talking about the legacy of everyday actions and the way you treat people.
Yeah, exactly. And the ripple effect that anything we do, even the most casual remark, can have on another person, let's say a young person who's looking for guidance in their lives. We all have experiences in our own past where something someone said, something someone did, the way a person looked at us, can sometimes have a tremendous effect in just shifting the course of what we then subsequently decide to do with ourselves. And so to be endlessly conscious of how our lives are always interacting with the lives of others, and those interactions are going to have effects and consequences. And so that to me is very central to the ethical perspective, and that those consequences will ripple on whether or not I write books, exactly, that's just an example, for anyone's life, with their children, with their colleagues, with their friends, with their church members, whatever it might be. We have a ripple effect in terms of what we say and do, and we need to, I think, accept that as a contribution we're making for the future in every act of our lives.
Mm-hmm. Of course, the specific consequences of our actions are hard to predict. I mean, I'm thinking of this Steven Spielberg movie, Saving Private Ryan, about World War II, where early on in the movie they show compassion to some German soldier that they could kill. They don't kill him. Needless to say, he comes back at the end of the movie to haunt them, and I think kills a bunch of people, and they wish they had killed him. So you can't be sure that every act of compassion will pay off in some obvious ethical sense. But what's your belief about, what's the basis for your belief that acting in certain ways, I gather with compassion and selflessness, will on balance make the world a better place 50 years from now?
Well, I have to be quite frank. I don't believe that just because you act with compassion that will therefore produce a good result. You can think of millions of counterexamples for people who do very compassionate things and make things worse. This is another big bugbear, I think, of a lot of popular Buddhism, which unfortunately is reinforced even by people like the Dalai Lama, who say what matters is your motivation, your intention. If you act with a good intention, everything will turn out fine. We have a saying in our culture, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. So it's not just about intentions. And when you look at Buddhist ethical writings, none of them say that. They recognize that the consequences of actions are, as you say, almost impossible to foresee. All we can do is our best. And every ethical act, therefore, has to be an act which is a risk. And I would advocate a Buddhist ethics of risk. The most we can do is to understand as best we can the situation that we are confronting. We cannot know what the right thing to do is, but we cannot not act if we are called upon from another person's need or suffering. We're moved by our own empathy, our own compassion. We cannot but.
Okay, and of course, I think we all have observed certain kinds of chain reactions that give us hope that maybe being good will have a legacy, right? I mean, somebody's a jerk to you and then you're a jerk to the next person because it upsets you, and that's a bad chain. And sometimes somebody's really nice to you, you're in a better mood. There's reason to believe that happens, I think. But I want to pause on this ethics question because there are differing views about the role of ethics in Buddhism. I've talked to people who, you say, what is your definition of enlightenment? And they give you kind of a purely experiential and maybe metaphysical definition, and you say, does enlightenment inherently involve anything ethical? And they say no. And so there are different views on this, but I take it that you are arguing not just that ethics should be central to what we think of as Buddhism, but that if you look at what is most plausibly the earliest kind of distinctive message of the Buddha, there is a big ethical dimension.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I find it kind of weird, actually, that Buddhists will say that enlightenment has got nothing to do with ethics. Enlightenment has to do with understanding the true nature of reality, etc., etc., etc. Look at the definition of enlightenment at the conclusion of the first discourse. The Buddha says, it was not until my knowledge and vision were entirely clear about the Four Noble Truths, but specifically the Four Noble Truths as tasks, I could not consider myself to have achieved a peerless enlightenment in this world. So enlightenment has to do with fully knowing and understanding dukkha, letting go of craving and reactivity, experiencing moments in which craving and reactivity have stopped, and cultivating the Noble Eightfold Path. That's enlightenment. It's not some one-off deep mystical insight into the nature of emptiness. He never says that. So I think once again, you see, once you go back to the early sources, a lot of what is presented as Buddhism in good faith from very good people turns out to actually not fit terribly well. And I think with our Western approach to understanding these traditions historically, understanding them as dependently originating phenomena, as the Buddhists would say, we have, I think, tools in our culture, historical tools, critical tools, to really recover something that I think has often got lost in Buddhism, and that is this primary ethical engagement with life that constitutes being awake. Being awake is not a simple single thing. It is a complex of interactions which have to do with everything that I am. And it's a process, not a state. That I think is also crucial. Again, I can quote chapter and verse to back this stuff up, but frankly, it probably won't have much influence on most Buddhists who are usually committed to a rather different way of seeing things.
Okay, well, I guess having answered the question of what enlightenment is a reasonable place to conclude. Thank you for clearing that up. And thanks for taking the time. So again, the latest book is After Buddhism, Rethinking the Dharma for a Secular Age. And what's the next book going to be?
I've got a book coming out again with Yale University Press next February. It'll be called Secular Buddhism, Imagining the Dharma for an Uncertain World. And that should appear, I think, in February or March next year.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for taking the time, Stephen Batchelor. Maybe we'll check in with you again down the road.
I hope so. Keep well, Bob. It's been a great conversation.
Okay.
And I hope whoever's listening to this finds something of value in it.
I'm sure they will. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot.